October 23, 2025, a day that upended global commerce and sent shockwaves through the world's financial capitals. As the sun rose over New York, few could have predicted the seismic shift about to unfold, one that would ripple from boardrooms to factory floors across the globe. In a landmark decision, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down President Trump's sweeping tariff regime, declaring the duties on hundreds of billions in imports illegal. The ruling was not just a legal technicality, it was a direct challenge to the economic strategy that had defined an era. The news hit Wall Street like a thunderclap. The ruling sent shockwaves through international markets, triggering a brutal sell-off as investors scrambled to grasp the new reality. Panic and confusion reigned as traders tried to make sense of what this meant for global supply chains and corporate profits. The Dow Jones suffered its steepest drop of the year, plunging within minutes of the announcement at Da. Businesses were left reeling as the trade framework they'd painstakingly adapted to vanished overnight, leaving executives and workers alike facing a future filled with uncertainty. For months, companies had twisted their supply chains to survive the tariffs, rerouting shipments, renegotiating contracts, and investing in new logistics. Now, all those plans were suddenly obsolete, and the scramble to adapt began anew, with no clear path forward. The decision capped a year of escalating trade wars and legal battles, unraveling a system that had become central to U.S. fiscal policy, generating nearly $30 billion a month. The legal fight had been fierce, but few expected such a definitive and immediate end. Its abrupt end left urgent questions about the government's budget and the future of global trade. Lawmakers and economists scrambled to assess the fallout, while government officials faced a sudden shortfall in revenue and a rapidly shifting economic landscape. Allies and adversaries alike had redrawn their strategies in response to the tariffs. Now, the rules were gone, replaced by confusion and instability. International partners wondered how to proceed, and old alliances were tested as new trade routes and agreements were hastily considered. The world watched as the foundation of global trade was torn up in a single morning. From Paris to Beijing, London to São Paulo, leaders and citizens alike tried to make sense of the new order, aware that the consequences would be felt for years to come. No one knew what would replace it, or when. The uncertainty was palpable, with businesses, governments, and individuals all searching for answers in a world suddenly without a roadmap. The only certainty: the era of tariff-driven chaos was over, but a new uncertainty had begun. The world now faced a future where the rules were unwritten and every nation, company, and individual would have to navigate the unknown. The now-defunct tariff policy was the centerpiece of Trump's second-term economic agenda. Launched in April 2025, it slapped a baseline 10% tariff on nearly all imports, a dramatic break from decades of free trade. The administration quickly escalated, targeting specific countries and products with even higher rates. By October, average tariffs soared to over 18%, levels unseen since the 1930s. The policy's unpredictability left businesses in a constant state of whiplash. Ending the de minimis exemption pulled millions of low-cost goods into the tariff net, raising prices for everyday Americans. The administration argued these measures would force fairer trade and revive U.S. manufacturing, but the pain was felt at the checkout. Supporters saw the tariffs as a bold stand for American industry. Critics called them a costly gamble. The tariffs weren't just policy, they were a declaration of a new, combative world order. The 20,000 tariffs in Pori, the study being den. Drive tariffs created a tangled web of duties and deals, ensnaring nations worldwide. What began as a targeted policy quickly spiraled into a global phenomenon, touching nearly every corner of the international marketplace. China, the main target, faced tariffs over 100% before a tense truce lowered them to 30%, but uncertainty lingered. Businesses and investors watched nervously as negotiations dragged on, and the threat of renewed escalation hung over every deal. The EU negotiated a 15% rate in exchange for massive U.S. investments and energy purchases, shifting the relationship from partnership to hard bargaining. European leaders found themselves balancing economic interests with political realities, as industries lobbied for relief and new alliances formed. Even close neighbors weren't spared. Canada faced up to 35% tariffs, straining a relationship once defined by open borders and mutual trust. Mexico was threatened with 30%, putting pressure on its export-driven economy and forcing leaders to rethink trade strategies. Both countries scrambled to adapt, with manufacturers shifting supply chains and workers facing new uncertainties about their jobs and futures. India and Brazil were hit with 50% tariffs, often tied to unrelated political disputes. For these emerging economies, the tariffs were a heavy blow, disrupting growth and sparking domestic debates about how to respond. Meanwhile, countries like the UK, South Korea, and Japan secured lower rates only by promising billions in US investments. These deals came with strings attached, reshaping economic priorities and deepening interdependence. The message was clear: market access now came at a steep price, and no one was immune. Every nation, big or small, had to weigh the costs of compliance against the risks of exclusion. Trade policy had become a tool of global leverage, merging economics with geopolitics. The world watched as leaders used tariffs not just for profit, but for power. The world's trading system was reshaped until the Supreme Court's ruling shattered it overnight, sending shockwaves through governments, markets, and everyday lives. The legal battle centered on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. The Trump administration claimed global trade imbalances were a national emergency, justifying sweeping tariffs. Courts disagreed, ruling that IEEPA was meant for targeted sanctions, not a wholesale rewrite of trade policy. The Supreme Court affirmed only Congress can impose broad tariffs and taxes. The decision reasserted constitutional limits on presidential power, ending years of executive overreach in trade. The verdict was a sharp reminder: the power of the purse belongs to Congress, not the White House. The boundary between executive action and legislative authority was redrawn. While politicians argued, American families felt the tariffs sting. Prices for groceries and essentials climbed, squeezing already tight budgets. Small businesses struggled as costs for imported materials soared, forcing tough choices: raise prices, cut jobs, or absorb losses. The promised manufacturing boom never arrived. Instead, many sectors saw stagnation or job losses. The end of the de minimis exemption hit online retailers hard, adding paperwork and costs to every small shipment. Major retailers warned of higher prices, confirming the burden fell on U.S. households, not foreign competitors. The tariffs' real legacy: higher costs, disrupted supply chains, and economic anxiety on Main Street. The Supreme Court's ruling offered hope for relief, but uncertainty remained. The tariff war split the nation. Supporters hailed the policy as a long-overdue defense of American industry, blaming foreign subsidies and unfair trade for lost jobs. They pointed to surging tariff revenue and promised a manufacturing revival. Critics, economists, businesses, and global institutions warned tariffs were a blunt, regressive tax that hurt consumers and slowed growth. They argued the trade deficit stemmed from domestic overspending, not foreign cheating. Retaliation from other countries hurt U.S. exporters, and inflation rose even as growth slowed. The IMF cut its global growth forecast, citing the trade war's fallout. For critics, tariffs were a self-inflicted wound, disrupting supply chains, fueling corruption, and shrinking the economy. The debate raged on, but the Supreme Court's decision forced a reckoning. The Supreme Court's decision unleashed chaos across global markets, sending shockwaves through every sector. Investors scrambled to make sense of the news, while financial analysts tried to predict what would come next. The uncertainty was immediate and profound. The legal foundation for trillions in trade vanished overnight, paralyzing trading floors and ports. Ships sat idle, containers stacked up, and the usual rhythm of global commerce ground to a halt as everyone waited for answers. Customs officials and businesses were left without guidance. Should tariffs be collected? Should goods be released or held? The rules that had governed international trade for years were suddenly gone, leaving confusion at every border. What about goods already in transit? Cargo ships and trains, loaded with products, were caught in limbo, unsure if they would be allowed to enter or face new restrictions. Shipments stalled, contracts were thrown into doubt, and companies that had spent months adapting to tariffs now faced costly reversals. Warehouses filled with goods that couldn't move, and business leaders scrambled to contact partners and customers. A U.S. bike maker that moved production to avoid tariffs suddenly questioned that decision. Workers paused on the assembly line, uncertain if their jobs were secure or if the company's strategy would need to change again. The uncertainty was worse than the tariffs themselves. No one knew what rules would come next. Boardrooms filled with tense debates, and analysts watched the markets for any sign of stability. Politically, the ruling ignited fierce debate. White House outrage, congressional celebration, and global confusion. The media swarmed government buildings, searching for statements and explanations. Trading partners wondered, would the US craft a new, legal tariff plan, or was paralysis ahead? Diplomats urgently sought clarification, fearing ripple effects on their own economies. The day's chaos stemmed from one fact: an entire economic system was dismantled with nothing ready to replace it. The world's supply chains, so carefully built, now faced unprecedented disruption. The world waited for Washington's next move. Every hour brought new rumors, but no clear answers. The future of global trade hung in the balance, as leaders, businesses, and citizens everywhere braced for what would come next. As the dust settles, America faces a crossroads. The Supreme Court's ruling ended a turbulent era, but left a policy vacuum. Will Washington craft a new trade strategy, or will gridlock prevail? For families, lower prices may come, but not overnight. For workers, fears of renewed foreign competition resurface. The US must now rethink its global role, repair alliances, and find a new consensus on trade. The end of the 2025 tariffs isn't the end of the story, it's the start of a new, uncertain chapter.